Thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure to be able to talk today. I thank you, Lucy, for setting me up so well. I'm not sure what I have to say that you haven't already said in some form, but I'll do my best to bring something new here. So I've worked on kind of a grab bag of stuff since I started off with DARE. The first year of setting up a center, it's there's a lot to be done, a lot of different areas that sort of need to be plowed. And so I find myself often asking when I give a talk similar to this, like what exactly, what do I do? What is the through line in everything that I've been working on in these different areas? And I think it's exactly along the lines of what Lucy has set up in terms of this fusion of probabilistic and deterministic models. And that's something, I guess, that with my physics background, I feel unusually well placed to offer. So to set this up again, or just to recall, this is a bit of a straw man, but there's this continuum that I often see either in the literature or in discussions between, on the one hand, deterministic or mechanistic models that are explicitly process-based. You can write down all the equations, and given some set of parameters and some data, you get out an answer. It preserves the causal structure of all of the processes that are occurring. They can sometimes be relatively inflexible unless you increase to a large number of parameters. On the other hand, you may also have statistical or machine learning models that are somewhat more flexible. They may be largely data-driven, but they may neglect causal structure. They may sometimes be arbitrarily flexible and end up overfitting. So those are both things that you have to guard against. There are certainly forms of these, like hierarchical Bayes or Bayesian networks that Lucy alluded to, that help to mitigate that a bit. And where I see myself sitting is somewhere in the middle, where you have processes that have random elements to them, and they may be random coefficients that are unknown or uncertain, either say in a calibration of a model, but they may also include random functions that involve, for example, a sensitivity curve from a sensor that is unknown. So the hope is that by using statistical models, or sometimes more flexible models for the pieces of the system that are connected in clear ways, you can unpack what the real drivers of variance in the system are. Once again, I think Bayesian methods are uniquely well suited to do this. This is the standard formulation, I guess, of Bayes' rule. On the one hand, you have a posterior distribution, which is your desired prediction or inference, where you say, the parameters of the model, they're expressed in terms of parameters of the model, which is some representation of the world that you're in, given the data that you have. And that can be expressed as a combination of likelihood, which is the probability of seeing a given set of data given a set of parameters. So that might be the star physics or geophysics, for example, in terms of understanding the measurements from a particular underground scenario. And then you'll also have a prior, which is a set of, the probability of seeing a set of coefficients or a particular world that you're in without first seeing the data. So the idea is you're building up an ensemble of all possible worlds that you could be in, either right now or sometime in the future, that are consistent with the data and the information you have in hand. And the nice thing in particular about this ethos is that it's very flexible, and you can take these. I've just factored this probability distribution into a bit based on prior knowledge and a bit based on the sensing process of the Ford model. And you can also subfactor each of those bits into each of the working parts. So for a river system, you might have discharge given rainfall, and then your observation from a ratings curve given the discharge. And so you can chain things together and build up a system in a really intuitive way, like Lego blocks. And that suits me for the way I tend to think about systems. Any of those blocks can also be process-based or numerical. Or if those numerical bits are very complicated and take a lot of time to run, you can use flexible statistical emulators that are trained from data based on simulations from those numerical models. It's also good for accounting for latent variables that you may not be able to see, you don't observe directly, or you may not observe them over the entire area or time span that you need in order to make good predictions and to understand the system. And that's the majority of what I do. I have to say that most of the problems I work on are actually inverse problems, where the quantity that we're interested in is not directly observed, or at least is very expensive to directly observe. So you're doing a lot of inference of what's going on, for example, beneath the surface or in a hydrological system from very sparse data that are cheaper and easier to take. All of this depends on actually having a good parameterization. So your choice of theta is important, and I'll get to that. So just to draw a few examples I'll take you through from the work that we've done. This first one is a fairly simple model. It's for reservoir levels from remote sensing data. So this is some work I did with Willem and his postdoc Ignacio Fuentes last year. So this is so we're interested in inferring the amount of water in a reservoir, but we don't have a direct measurement of the height. What we do have are overhead sensors that can detect the overhead area of the water, and most of these reservoirs would also have sloped sides like I've drawn here. So the process is that water rises in the reservoir and floods an area viewed by an infrared remote sensor in this way. The world parameterization in this case is the water level D, it's how much water is in there, but it also can include aspects of the sensor response, like the change in a water index relative to the coverage of a particular pixel by a fraction of water. So you can see you can go up and down, and as the water level changes, the overhead area changes. The forward model in this case, if you divide this area now up into pixels, the response in the pixel will depend on the flooded area. So you can determine the flooded area from the height, and also an elevation model that you might have of that reservoir that'll typically be on a fine resolution and convenient to work with. So that'll include that and the detector characteristics as well. The pixel size, the sensitivity, a noise level, all of those are things we don't really care about, and we want to just average over all possible views of them. We may have some prior information on that, on how sensitive we think the sensors are, how big the noise is. The likelihood in this case is Gaussian. We expect Gaussian noise to first order. So here's our model. Of course, real data is a little bit more complicated, but that model works surprisingly well. So in this case, here's data from infrared sensing on a particular reservoir. Here's the prediction of our forward model. We're actually able to generate synthetic data, compare it to what we actually saw. And here are the residuals. You see there are a little bit, there are some crusty things around the edges. We saw all kinds of things like checkerboard patterns and bright and dark edges to these before we accounted for things like the registration of the image that we hadn't included in our model before. When all is said and done, you get a fairly Gaussian, maybe only slightly skewed set of residuals from the data, and you can see that you have an almost perfectly linear trend line going from fully empty pixels to completely flooded pixels. So we're able to generate the data. We can see that it's a pretty good fit. The second example is a little bit more complex situation where we've been working with DeepEye, as Willem said, to understand uncertainty in the overall water balance in a catchment. So this is actually quite a complex problem. You have many different kinds of processes going on, rainfall, evaporation from open water, or transpiration from plants. You may have interactions between a river and the groundwater next to it. You'll have as well gaugings along a river that'll tell you what the discharge from that river is at any particular point as the water flows along to the sea. So various different processes, all of which are connected together in this Lego block kind of way that I've described. So the actual parameterization of our model in terms of probabilities in any given part of this will depend on the piece of the system, but it's usually some kind of spatiotemporal field, like rainfall map of the rainfall over an area, map of evapotranspiration, for example. For a river, you might have the height as a function of where you are on the river, and the overall flow through the river may be different at different points. So you'll also have forward models for each of these, both in terms of the process that's occurring and in terms of the way that the process that you use to sense them. So for a gauging station, you'll have a ratings curve that will describe in terms of some proxy like the height or flow at a given part of the river, what the volume of water flowing through that is. So the volume is not directly observed, even though that's what something like a runoff model will predict. So this is how you chain things together, and you account for uncertainties in each of these parts, particularly the latent parts that aren't directly observed, by saying, what are all the possible values it could have had that produce the data that I see? So almost all of these in the example of we've taken a section of a river to work with as a simplified example during a dry season, so that we had to deal mostly with evapotranspiration, direct discharge along the river, and groundwater and surface water interactions. Those are sort of the three main processes in this case. And all of those can be treated in some way as some kind of random function. So we've been using a particular kind of statistical model called a Gaussian process that allows you to, it's often used for interpolation, but it's really used for any kind of random function, not just interpolation problems. So these are valuable in particular because DPI and NSSN are interested in how you might place additional sensors to improve our knowledge of this system. And Gaussian processes give you a very straightforward, from a machine learning standpoint, a straightforward and tractable way of telling you where the maximum information gain is from placing new sensors. So anytime we can use those in a problem like this, we're golden. So in this case, of course, there's a lot of great work done by my colleagues Gilad Francis and our research engineer Josh Simmons, as well as Willem and myself. So we have views again according to these random functions of each of these different processes. Josh here is on the left made a map of evapotranspiration across an area and then restricted it to a river over a particular gauging point in a river over time. Similarly, Gilad has synthesized different measurements taken of a ratings curve as it may change over time. So you have transport of sediments through a river, for example, will change the shape of the river and therefore the inference you would have from your proxy. So in each of these cases, you've got measurements that have been made in the past, and a nice fit to them that includes, in this case, this fairly small amount of possible ratings curves that are consistent with those readings. My piece of it gives an example of the flexibility of the Gaussian process regime, where you have now different groundwater stations that are taken, as well as surface water readings along the river. And if you're interested in modeling the groundwater head, you can express that as a spatial field with some kernel that represents the correlations between different possible values of the groundwater head at different points spatially. So for any instantaneous slice in time, it might look something like this. But you can do more than that because you've got a random function. It's not just an interpolation. You can take the derivative of that. The derivative is also a random function. You can form, in fact, a whole differential equation like Darcy's law, describing the diffusion of groundwater from that same random function. So you can see as well, I'm able to predict what the flow of groundwater looks like in terms of these arrows. So here's the hydraulic head, and here's again the time rate of change of storage from Darcy's law, expressed in this map down here. So you can see water flowing through, areas of high storage, areas of low storage, and places where the groundwater is gaining and places where it's losing. So you can do all that and in an uncertainty quantified kind of way, and then propagate those forward onto uncertainties in the recharge of storage during a given time period or in a given area, for example. So I don't know. Okay, there we go. So the third example I want to show is actually in a completely different area now. It's geological and geophysical inversions for applications such as mineral exploration or geothermal exploration. So in this case, we have a process. The process is not necessarily a time process, but it's a description of the causal factors that give rise to the data. So in this case, you have geological events that happen over millions of years that shape what's the different rock formations underneath the ground. So the present day observations of that will probe the geometry and the composition of these rock units that you can see in this schematic 3D cross section here. So the world parameterization, you might choose some small number of parameters to describe what these things look like. So there will be a number of rock layers, for example. There will be the properties of each rock layer, like its density and its magnetic properties. And then the parameters for the geometry, which might include knots for splines or the equivalent to interpolate these surfaces dividing the different rock layers in space. So ultimately, you want to specify a 3D field of rock properties, and usually you can. Let's see. Here we go. Forward models here in this case would include any way that you can get an observable from this 3D world. So it might include a direct query. You just drill a hole. That'll be expensive, and you can only do a small number of them, but you can do it. And include the influence of that on your beliefs about the subsurface. You might have interpolation of different measurements made at the surface from structural geology, so just a geologist walking around the surface and noting what they see. There might be as well geophysical measurements that are made often using some kind of partial differential equation or a big linear system. So all of those sensor quantities, whether it's human or machine-based, will be included in this situation. You can see the data generated from that 3D volume in this way. So what I'd shown you previously was derived from an engine called Obsidian that I did some work with in the run-up to the DARE proposal. But I quickly realized that was built explicitly for sedimentary basins. So it wasn't necessarily a good general purpose engine. When you get to mineral systems, you have engines that include features such as these, where you're actually able to specify in some parameterized way a series of different kinematic events. So you'll have actually telling the history of a region in the same way that a geologist would. You'd say, well, we start with this rock layer, and then this layer was laid down, and then this layer was laid down, then there was a fault. And then maybe another layer was laid down, and then you have a fold, for example, that compresses the rock laterally and forms a sine wave pattern. Maybe some of that is eroded, and so on. So you can see that through this series of events, you build up a picture of a 3D volume. So we have on the left, you can see some sample geologies from an engine called NADI, which was built by our colleague Mark Jessel at UWA for his master's thesis back in the 1980s. And it's still in use because it turns out that this is a fantastically useful tool for being able to visualize the different ways in which these processes can give rise to different signals. So I built my own version of this as well, with a simplified version for reasons that I'll get into in a minute, because I tried using NADI and I discovered that it gave me some very odd probability distributions, and they tended to be broken up with little islands that you'll see at the bottom left there. This is a simplified example where I've tried to reproduce what I was seeing just with a sphere, just a spherical intrusion that's slightly different density from the area around it. That gives rise to a gravitational signal on the surface, where we now have a sensor that we're filtering our idea through of what the underneath looks like. So it turns out that if your representation is blocky and it only includes voxels that are wholly inside one unit or outside it, then you have a situation where you maybe get something that looks vaguely like your initial probability distribution, but it might be biased and it might have the wrong variance and also be broken up into these little islands. And this is not a real effect, because if you take a smaller voxel size, it starts to go away. But you can still see in the second from the left, this little terracing, this funny look of this probability distribution between the sphere's radius and its density. These are things we're trying to infer. If you then account for that, it turns out you can do much better. But basically, all the off-the-shelf geology engines I could find did it in this way. They did it assigning each parcel of ground to be completely within or without some other section. So turns out this is a well-known problem in computer science, where if you don't account for the ability of partial pixels along these sharp boundaries, it will look blocky to our eye. But it'll be even worse for inference methods if you're trying to get the right probability distribution, including the effects of this is important. Here's an example now of a fully kinematic engine where we can generate gravity signals based on a series of tectonic events. And you can see if we don't account for the aliasing effect, you get a really funny looking, highly biased and wrong variance distributions of different rock, different properties of the model, whether it's the thickness of a layer or the density of a slab of rock or the angle of a fault or what have you. So you can fix that in part by taking smaller voxels, but then you increase your computing time by factors of 100 or something, or 1,000 or more, depending on how big your model is. So the anti-aliasing prescription that we developed allows you to get much closer to what I would consider is close to the true model as we're able to compute, the infinite resolution model, with much less computational effort. So that's all I wanted to lead you through. We've got some exciting things planned for the future. These are all, for example, the geologies that I just showed you are essentially idealized geologies. We'd like to account for deviations from those, but since we don't necessarily, if we don't care about them so much, we can integrate them out. We can integrate over all possible deviations that we can have from this conceptual model of the geology. So that's a project that's in the waiting in the wings. The idea of doing conceptual model selection for kinematic geology, so actually being able to really implement something like a robot geologist, where we're able to propose different possible histories for an area and select among them according to the probabilities from the data that we have. So that's a much more ambitious project that could go for a while. You can include one or more PhD projects. Other ideas, we have uncertainty quantified soil moisture, and of course, advanced techniques to make all of these things run faster. So that's all I have. Thanks for your time and attention. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them now or find me in one of the breaks.